Greetings and salutations. This is Abdelhadi with The Bitter Truth, where we may not have all the answers, but we're going to ask an awful lot of questions. You can also support the show by visiting thebittertruth.info. And, you can buy some fabulous swag there to make your life better. You can also jump on our Patreon link there, and we appreciate the support. We also have a Venmo, Abe Abdelhadi, and, the donate button on the bittertruth.info goes right to a PayPal page. So any support of the show is appreciated. You can also listen to the show at no charge for on Spotify and iTunes and YouTube and all the places where you listen to podcasts. But today I'm excited. I've got a really great guest, interesting guy. He grew up in the West Bank in Amman, Jordan. Went to high school in Beirut for a couple of years. He's been an aviator, flying humanitarian missions. Most recently, combat casualties in South Sudan. He is fluent in Arabic. He's what I would call an Arabist. A lot of people, get expertise in all that when, we get ready to go bomb Syria or something like that. And you see a bunch of knotheads on the news, but this gentleman knows his stuff. Bill Kelsey, how are you, man?
Real good, real good. Thank you for having me on.
Hey, man. Cool. Yeah, no, listen, I know we were, chatting offline for a little bit and going back and forth with some emails, and you're one of a few people that I would say knows the whole issue of the Israel-Palestine deal, and you go back further than most people. And I just wanted to kind of jump into it, starting kind of a little bit with it. We only have about 30, 40 minutes, but getting into the 19th century and early Zionism. I mean, I'd heard in the past, like in the 1790s, early 1800s, that Napoleon had been offered by Jews in France to, fight in the war when he was going to go back into Jerusalem. And they said, hey, if you give us Palestine, we'll fight for you. And he's like, yeah, no, that's okay. That's a little bit much. But so Zionism has been around for quite a while before it got popular in the 1900s, right?
Well, there's always been a proto-Zionism, a mystical Zionism. But really, the serious modern Zionism, there are two points of origin in the 1830s. Evangelical and fundamentalist Christians began really developing the theory, and they actually preceded the Jewish Zionists. The Jewish Zionists were not until the 1890s, most significantly with Herzl publishing The Jewish State. When Herzl published The Jewish State, the overwhelming position of Jewish leaders was to reject it as something they had been working against, and was in fact parallel and syncretic with anti-Semitism. The anti-Semite would say, you Jew, you do not belong in Europe. Well, that's what the Zionists said. Okay, we don't belong in Europe. The anti-Semite would say, you're not loyal to your own country that you live in. You're all loyal to each other. You're foreigners. The Zionists said, okay, we are all those things. That's how the Jewish Zionism developed. The Christian Zionism, it has to do with the fact that within fundamentalist and evangelical currents for centuries, they have used the Jewish people and the scriptures as a tarot card, as coffee grounds and coffee cups, where you're trying to tell the fortunes. And they look at the history of the Jewish people, and they try to figure out or Nostradamus. People try to dissect Nostradamus. People look at horoscopes, and among all the burdens that the Jewish people have to bear is the fact that other groups of people around the world, besides just the Christians, look at them as some great big horoscope that is whatever happens to the Jewish people, they'll predict the future with it. And they look at the book of Daniel and Ezekiel and cross-correlate to the book of Revelation, and basically figured out in their minds that in order for Jesus to come back and usher in the millennium, the Jews had to go back to Palestine. and there are many variations on what comes first, second, and third, but the people that tried to predict usually had bad results. The people that waited for things to happen, then they could look back and say, aha, this was predicted. And whatever happens in the Middle East, you can find an ancient verse that predicts it. If there's a war between Syria and Israel, you'll find a verse that predicts it. If there's peace, there's a verse that predicts it. If there's a victory on the part of Israel, there's a verse that predicts it. If there's a defeat, there's a verse that predicts it. So it's a very convenient thing to work it backwards. The Christian Zionists have had a lot more luck working backwards, except that the millennium hasn't arrived and Jesus hasn't come. I remember arriving in the United States in 1967, right after the Arabs had a very humiliating and embarrassing defeat and Jerusalem was captured. And at that time, the Christians in America, it was a challenge for me to go to church because they were just exuberantly excited about the fact that any minute now Jesus could come back because the Israelis had captured eastern Jerusalem, which included the ancient Temple Mount.
Right.
So, yeah, so the Christian Zionists, I think, are in a lot of ways a bigger problem than the Jewish Zionists.
But don't both of those groups kind of fly in the face of, and I'm not religious, I don't have a dog in this fight, but don't they fly in the face of spiritual teaching to begin with? I mean, God doesn't need our help, right? I mean, even, and we talked a little bit about this offline, but in 1900, a bunch of rabbis out of Haifa wrote an ersatz white paper called the Olar Sharem. And they're basically, this was when Zionism was, getting a good foothold in Palestine. And they were out of Haifa, and they're basically saying, hey, without a spiritual mandate, this is, a man-made deal isn't going to work out. And they were very detailed. We got good relationships with our Arab neighbors. If you want to go after anybody for anti-Semitism and programs, it's Europe. And, last I checked, the UN and Britain aren't divine. So why do the Christians and the Zionist Israelis jump all over this shit?
It's the crust of the earth is in serious danger of cracking due to the weight of all of the books that have been written on the subject that you brought up. It's scientifically proven, and there are in evangelical circles, and my parents were evangelical missionaries in Jordan, and I can assure you they were not part of this.
Sure.
And there has always been a minority that pointed out that this is not correct. And more and more evangelicals, as opposed to fundamentalists, you might say the evangelicals are fundamentalists with the human face. They're a little more tolerable. And many of them have said this is heresy. And so that's on the Christian side. On the Jewish side, whether you're anti-Zionist or whether you're Zionist, you can't fit it into one cookie cutter, because on both camps, you'll have the very ultra-religious, you'll have the secular, you'll have the communist, and socialist, you'll have the non-socialist, you'll have libertarian types and free market types. You have atheists, you have non-atheists. So in both camps. So among the Zionists, you have everything from Trotskyites to fundamentalist Neturei Karta, who would be the spiritual successors of the rabbis that you named, where they delight in showing up at if there's an Israeli Independence Day celebration, they'll come wearing waving Palestinian flags and really provocative, and they look like the stereotypical fundamentalists sure. With the side locks and the clothing of Poland of 400 years ago, and they speak Yiddish and they denounce Israel in terms much more strongly than the most angry Palestinians do. Among the Christians, it's very fascinating. I happened upon a book when I came back to the States in a library. A lot of, as I said, so much has been written. I found a book written in the 1930s. I think the author was an evangelist named Rice. either Rice or Tice. I'm going to try to find that book. But he had it all worked out based on his reading that Italy was going to win World War II, that there was going to be a war, that Italy would be dominant. Germany didn't play much of a part in it, but Mussolini was going to be leading this, and that Italy would sponsor a Jewish return to Palestine and lead it, and that this Jewish state in Palestine would be the Antichrist of all things. And it would be something bad. And he worked it out that it was but that it was a good thing, but that it was the Antichrist, and that at least it would signal the pending return of Jesus and the Battle of Armageddon and all sorts of hallucinations. So what's happened is that the Zionists are somewhat embarrassed by these Christian fundamentalists, but they've worked out a way to use them as useful idiots. And the Christian Zionists, in turn, have it worked out where they see the Jewish Zionists as playing part of God's plan, even if God's plan is rather confusing at times.
Well.
So.
Oh, God, I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm just saying that there have always been. There's a fellow in Lubbock who wrote a book, The Armageddon Industry, and it actually goes back a long time, where people have been trying to predict when Jesus will return a second time, and they're always trying to interpret current events. If there's an earthquake in Jerusalem, which there was in 1834, and when Napoleon invaded. But this thing went on steroids, probably. The theory started in the 1830s when Allenby marched into Jerusalem right before Christmas in December of either 17 or 19. That was the first Christian to rule Jerusalem in almost 1,000 years, and that for sure people began believing the end of the world was at hand. When the state of Israel was founded, that was another mark, except they didn't have East Jerusalem. Then they got East Jerusalem, and now this was supposed to be the end time. I remember in 1991 when there was, as the war developed with Iraq, this industry cranked up again. There were 4 books written with the title From Babylon to Armageddon, Babylon being Iraq. Mm-hmm. And so Saddam Hussein was fit into this, and the ancient verses that had to do with the ancient Babylonian rulers were applied to Saddam Hussein, and Nebuchadnezzar went crazy. And so here was a case of Saddam Hussein for sure was repeating it, and he was going crazy. And the end of the world was pending.
Well, and you touched on something that I wanted to ask you about, because the average American will just shrug off this entire issue as, oh, they've had problems for thousands of years. This is just more of the same shit. And that's not at all true, is it?
No, you can cherry pick. I mean, if you want to find a case of Jews getting massacred in Damascus in the 1840s, you can. But you can also find cases of Christians or any other minorities, and at the same time, it depends what you want to look for. You have whole periods of history where things were quite good for the Jewish people in the Islamic world. When they were expelled from Spain, and the Sultan of in Istanbul found out that they were expelling the Jews from Spain, he said, whoa, why would Spain get rid of such a treasure? Let them come into my empire. And so he welcomed them into his empire. He said, why are the Christians in Spain, these Catholics, what why are they getting rid of a good deal? So he welcomed them, and they moved in the Middle East. They lived among the Arab world, and every so often you can find a quote where something good or bad happened, and that leads me to a phenomenon I've observed that's very important. Every so often there will be a debate coming up about whether things are good or bad for Jews in Iran. And one anti-Zionist Jewish friend will point out how good they are. And another one, a Zionist, will insist that things are bad for the Jews in Iran. And they'll argue, and they'll try to have a dueling war of facts and pseudo-facts and counterfacts. But the deeper thing is that in the Zionist psychology, what's developed is there is a need to believe that things are bad. The guy who's arguing that things are bad in Iran for the Jewish people, what's really happening, the real thing that you have to hear from him is that he wants them to be bad for Jews in Iran. In order to sustain the logic of Zionism, things have to be bad. If things are perfect for Jews in Argentina, the Jews of Argentina do not migrate to Israel.
Right. Well,
if
and then
things are bad in Argentina, the Jews in Argentina migrate. Yeah. So they end up being soldiers. They get more soldiers. And if things are bad in France, I mean, you notice this whenever there's an anti-Semitic attack in France.
But
it's as though the Zionists want there to be bad stuff.
See, but then, more recently, and I've had this argument with two types of Iranians myself. I don't call them Persian. They always say that because they're afraid of, the 70s again or whatever. But, Persia's been gone a long time. So it's Iran. But I've run into both types of Iranians. And the fact is that Jews in Iran have more rights than Palestinians in Israel. That's not disputable. That's not disputable. That's not disputable. The Jews in Iran have it better than Palestinians in Israel. And isn't it true that in the 20th century, Ben Gurion and even before him, they spent a lot of time attacking Jews in other Arab countries to get them to move to Israel? Is that not true?
Well, it's complicated. I have read Tom Segev is a very incomplete, and another is a biography of Ben Gurion that I finished reading recently. When Ben Gurion first arrived in Palestine, and he had organized as a Zionist, atheist Zionist, by the way, but with a fast arrived, he was very disturbed by the total number of Palestinians that were on the streets. These were all interlopers in his view, but he really got bothered by the fact that many other Jews were hiring Palestinians,
right,
or were hiring Muslims. Some of the Jews were Palestinians, Arabic speaking, just like they're Muslim Palestinians, they're Druze Palestinians, they're Christian Palestinians.
Sure,
they were Jewish Palestinians, a small minority, about 3%. But, and by the time Ben Gurion arrived, I think the numbers are about 3% were native Arabic speaking, essentially Arab Jews. And about 3% were people who'd arrived over the last 4 centuries to study the scriptures and die there. And just form scholarly communities, or even the proto-Zionism, and then 3%, and gradually more and more were European Jews who came over in response to the Zionist movement, and so he went to these people and he insisted that they get rid of their their Palestinian employees. He made that a big campaign, and that was his main obsession was, why are you making it good for Palestinians? Why are Palestinians earning a living? Well, these were Palestinians who were born and had been there. I mean, in their DNA, they include ancient Jews who converted to Islamic Christianity and eventually began speaking Arabic. So he just didn't like them there. So his main obsession from the beginning was to get Jews into Palestine and to get the Arabs out. And that was a program from the beginning. And at the time that he was expressing that program, at most 9% of the people were Jewish in Palestine. What you're referring to as where they did monkey, but every Arab country had a story about why the Jews left, just as every Palestinian village has a story about why the Palestinians left their villages. In fact, each family has a different story. But in Iraq, is where this is the clearest. And there were few incidents in Egypt where Israeli intelligence did black flag operations, did things like blowing up Jewish-owned cinemas and what else did they blow up? Some synagogues in Baghdad and disguised them as Arab attacks. Now it sounds like a far-fetched story, but the guy who did it had an attack of conscience in his old age and reported on it. I should have had his name ready if I'm talking about him, but he can be found. And there is a body of information about how now the Iraqis played their part. There was primitive tribalism in Iraq, as we have here in the States. You read that Jews are tossing Palestinian Muslims out of their homes in Palestine. A certain number of stupid people in Iraq can say, well, if they're doing that in Palestine, well, and let's loot some Jews here. That did happen.
Sure.
And the Israeli intelligence or the Israeli pre-Israel state, they were very, very clever in doing this, in manipulating it and working with the worst tendencies in the Arab world. Same thing happened in Egypt. They did, in fact, it's known as the Levant affair, and it was a big scandal not because they did it, but because they got caught.
Right.
And they used local Zionists. Well, as with the Jews in Russia, what my Jewish friends have explained to me was always about 1/3 would become patriotic communists or nationalists for whatever country they lived in. 1/3 would become Zionists, and 1/3 wanted to go to America and become millionaires.
Right.
And that would be the case in the Arab world too. A lot of Jews, as with Muslims and Christians, they want to go to America, and some didn't want to have anything to do with their comfortable life getting disrupted, and others said, no, we're not part of this. We'll move to Palestine as soon as we can and be part of the Israeli experiment. So some of the local Zionists in Egypt, that say that from the 1/3 that wanted to be Zionists, they were used to plan. Blew up an American consulate and cultural center, and among other things, and some certain Jewish property. But the Egyptians caught them and got confessions out of them, and the Israelis had to admit that it happened. And there was a scandal in Israel called the Levant affair.
Right. Well, in the time we got remaining, I think in the last 30 plus years, you've been seeing more coverage. It was for a while. In the last 5-10 years, it's I think, in my opinion, gone down. But you saw a lot of coverage of the IDF and some of the atrocities they were committing on civilians, not Hamas, not Hezbollah, just civilians, like shooting them wholesale in the street, the whole 9 yards. But the IDF has a history of this shit with the Haganah forces, right?
Well, yeah, it goes back. They like to say they're in a tough neighborhood, and certainly uh, in the Hasbara War, Hasbara, I think most people know that word. It's the Israeli practice of developing a very well-oiled machine to explain themselves. They will divert the conversation to atrocities in Burma or China and then get people arguing about how big the atrocity is in Burma. And of course, the answer to that, from my point of view, is that you don't have U.S. senators falling all over each other declaring what a wonderful democracy we have in Burma and how we have to increase the aid to it. So, yeah, there are atrocities there. People are playing hardball, and they did expel. It's important. There's a detail people aren't aware of because it's very ingrained in the American consciousness that the Israeli state declared itself, and then these very nasty Arab armies immediately invaded. Well, the truth is that long before any Arab army invaded, the Israelis were expelling, the Haganah forces were expelling Palestinian civilians. And this was becoming a problem in the Arab countries because more and more refugees were showing up in Amman and Damascus and clogging up the villages. I mean, it's when you've got a developing country that's just emerging, and take a city like Amman, where I grew up at the time of the Palestinian arrival, the refugees that arrived in Amman tripled the population of the city. And just think of the sewage problems. The city could reek. I mean, how you fill up your mosques, you fill up your schools, and then eventually the shanty towns to develop. But the Palestinians were on the run from well-organized Haganah militias. In some cases, like I said, every village had its story. In some cases, they were massacred. They thought they were staying out of the fighting, and Deir Yassin was the most famous one, and that was the one that the Israelis then said made sure every villager knew that if you don't get out of your village, what happened at Deir Yassin will happen in your village. And so a number of villages that were unprotected or didn't have any militia members, people panicked and fled. Others fought. But the thing is, if they made peace with the Israelis, they stood or stayed out of the fighting, they stood a chance of getting massacred.
Right.
If they fought back, they're accused of being terrorists. If they flee, there's a Hasbara thing. Oh, they fled on their own. They didn't fight for their land, so they don't really care for it. Why should they deserve it? And so whatever the Palestinians did, there's a Hasbara argument against them. And it's tough, The question is, what would you have the Palestinians do given this onslaught?
Well, it's a white colonial.
There were some villages that managed to make.
But that's the.
I was going to say Nazareth.
Go ahead.
We're breaking up a little bit. I hope it doesn't mess up the program. But anyway, there was a general, a Canadian World War II veteran who was leading the area to conquer the Galilee, and he did clean out, expel a lot of Muslim villages. But then he got to Nazareth, and he said, "You know what? The Christians in the West aren't going to appreciate me expelling people from this Christian's, basically a very large town." And he went in. He made a deal with them. He said, "Look, surrender, and I'll promise not to throw you all out." And he made this deal, but he got into so much trouble from the rest of the Israeli authorities in the IDF or the Haganah at the time that he left Israel and never came back and never discussed it again. So it was a very conscious effort to get rid of as many as possible.
But to your point, you made a point a second ago that I wanted to talk about, was that you asked, if they do this, they're terrorists. If they do this, they're not, or whatever. But isn't that the way it is when you have a white colonial European construct? I mean, it's no different than the United States calling Indians savages, right? And or black people, but whatever, slaves, they called slaves all kinds of things, and justified it, using it to justify their atrocities. And then, the thing that has always bothered me about this, and this is something, I used to say to people all the time, was if Israel happened in 1848, not 1948, we wouldn't be having this discussion. The reason why anyone's still paying attention to this is because the Palestinians have been able to, steadily and consistently, make a case for the fact that their land was stolen, and they don't want to end up like the American Indian. And I think the attitude and the arrogance is out of a white colonial settler construct. I mean, you look at how the settlements are being handled the last 40, 45, 50 years, and Palestinians are just expected to take it. And if they fight back, they're called terrorists. It's like, well, you just took the guy's house.
Well, it's not even necessary for you and I to say it, because the earliest Zionists, I forget, I think it was Herzl himself. If it wasn't Herzl, it was Weizmann, who said we'll form a rampart of European colonialism against Asian barbarism. And that's they who said it, not me.
Right. Sure. Well, and then
rampart. Well,
and then let me ask you, as we got a few minutes left here, let me ask you a question. Because I know a lot of Palestinian Americans. My dad's side of the family is Palestinian. They all want to free Palestine. Realistically, do you think there could be one, or should they just right now accept, and this is not going to happen either, but accept equal rights, reparations, Gaza and West Bank allowed to be part of Israel and have equal rights, and then we pay them reparations for land we stole from them? Is that something that could be worked out realistically, you think, given the current mindset of not just the government, because it's a right-wing government in Israel, but most of the people now I'm finding in Israel are more right-wing than they were, say, 20 years ago?
Well, I'll tell you, the most enlightened and forward-thinking Palestinians and Israelis, and these are the people that I like to hang out with, they are talking about exactly that, the one country solution. They say one state solution. For me, I just, the word state rubs me the wrong way. I prefer to say the one country solution. And essentially, it's for the Palestinians would accept that it is one country now. The Israelis do control all of the borders of historic Palestine. They control the water. They control aviation access. They control the air. They control all the sea lanes. Gaza has seashore, but their fishing boats can't go out more than 3 miles. So, and they have a pseudo state within a state, the Bantustan on the West Bank and Gaza, where the Palestinian authorities have the right to deal with their own traffic and their own crimes and their own internal issues. But when you cross, say, from Jordan into the West Bank or from Egypt into Gaza, there are Israeli monitors at the checkpoints, and it was negotiated in great detail, but there are Israelis who vet. So if I want to go to the West Bank, it's not just the Palestinians who have to let me in and give me a visa, it's the Israelis across the border. If you were to go back to your father's village and marry yourself a local Palestinian girl, like they would all want you to do, the Palestinians would be happy to, yeah, that's your job. When Palestinians would be happy for you to come back and do that. But you wouldn't be able to live there.
Right.
The village would let you live there. The Palestine Authority would let you live there.
But I got 90 days.
But the
and I got to
Israelis
split.
have the right to say, no, you're not allowed to live there.
Yeah. I got 90 days.
Yeah. Yep. And so it's not autonomy. So anyway, the one country solution would be recognize that Israel has full control. Now, let's be the democracy you claim to be.
Bingo.
Whatever the law is for the Jew, let it be for the Palestinian. Do you shoot a Jewish kid when he throws a rock at a soldier, which happens?
Yep.
I mean, they throw rocks at soldiers, especially some of the religious Jews when they see people, when somebody tries to draft them, or they have people coming into their neighborhoods misbehaving on the Sabbath or dressing immodestly. They can get a little bit rowdy. Do the police shoot them? Do the police blow up their houses? No? Okay, then you can't do it to the Palestinians. Do you shoot Jewish demonstrators and rioters like they're jackrabbits? No, you don't do that to the Palestinians either. Do you give the Jews the right to vote? Yes. Do you give the Palestinians? Yes. Now, the Palestinians have the right to vote inside of the
Israel, right?
So-called 1948 Israel, from
right.
The part that they controlled up till June of 67.
Right.
And the part that they occupied after 67 has settlements and has military control with Palestinian autonomy in the main towns and cities. Those people should all, in my view, just accept voting in the Israeli and use the infrastructure of Israel, and gradually it would be a two cultural, two language groups, multi-faith society. Jonathan Kutab, a childhood friend of mine from Jerusalem, who's a lawyer who practices law in Hebrew and English and in Arabic, is one of the latest to come up with his plan for a one-country solution. People quibble about the details. There's so many coming out from Palestinians, from Israelis, from joint movements together. Some very old. Avraham Berg is probably the highest-ranking ex-Zionist to endorse this. Then there's Peled. I actually met General Peled, the father of the young Peled, who's written a book, The General's Son.
No, I know Miko Peled. He's been on the show a few times. Yeah,
Miko Peled. Yeah, I haven't met Miko. We're Facebook friends, but who isn't? But I did meet his father at a salon in Jerusalem in '91, and he's a very interesting liberal Zionist from the establishment Zionist, but then their children now are anti-Zionist. So there is a very small but growing group of conscientious objectors, people who are saying, let's work let's stop with the nonsense of the two-state solution, which is a farce, and
it's a lie. It's something that so-called liberal Jews like to pitch to sound nice, but if you look at the West Bank, it's a complete pockmark. It's just pockmarked of what it was in '67. It doesn't even exist, and make that, and it's just anyway. Well, hey, listen, man, we're about out of time, but I really wanted to say thanks for coming on and just sharing.
There's so much more to say. I'd love
sure.
Do it again, and next time talk about what can we do, because everything I've said, there's a Hasbara response to, and then there's a response I have to the Hasbara response. It gets to be like chewing old bubble gum at a time. What should we do, and what's the duty of the American? For me, it's never vote for any politician that insists on raising the size of the welfare or contributing to that welfare check of Israel. I think it should be cut off immediately and unconditionally to all regimes, every government around the world. But Israel's the one that gets the lion's share of the foreign aid. And I really would like to see that cut off.
Yeah, I agree with you, man. I agree with you. Well, folks, my guest has been Bill Kelsey, and we've been talking a little bit about Israel-Palestine. So hopefully some food for thought, as always. If this show makes you uncomfortable, it's supposed to. Sleep tight.